Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Welcome back to Intro to Rhetoric. Today, we resume our discussion of Unit 2 of the first three strategies, and today we're going to be in Part 4, How to Tell a Story. This work is heavily adapted from a book called How to Tell a Captivating Story by the podcast The Moth. I really think it's instructive in people when they're considering how to set up their narrative to achieve the best rhetoric they can get. We have one objective today. By the end of this class, you should be able to discuss the steps in crafting a story to use narrative as a strategy in rhetoric. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 6. First, I want to discuss the fact that the story is not an anecdote. It's far more complete than what an anecdote would be. Does the story that you want to tell have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Does it have tension to it? Is there a sense of risk and climax to it? Does it show some kind of a transformation to it? If it's just an anecdote talking about how you went to the store one day, but it doesn't have a plot line and a conflict and some resolution to it, it's not really a story. It can't count as narrative. If it doesn't have a story arc, then it's just an anecdote, and it doesn't count as narrative storytelling and would be outside the scope of this class. For example, when you're telling a story, you aren't just describing what happened when you walked into a coffee shop and saw your ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend out on a date. You're telling us how that moment felt, how it felt emotionally, how you were affected by it, how you reacted, and how maybe you're a different person after encountering and enduring that moment. If it, like I said, it has to have some development to it. Otherwise, it may be an interesting anecdote, but it doesn't count as narrative storytelling. Subpoint B. You should also find a meaningful story along the way, something that actually has some impact to it. Everybody has hundreds of stories that they could tell. Does a rhetor know which one to tell, which story actually they should lean into? Part of this will be driven on the issue that you're trying to persuade upon, but good rhetors can adapt a lot of different stories to serve the point they want to make. A lot of times rhetors, have like a stock handful of stories that they'll adapt over and over again. Think back to the moments in your life that really shifted you in some way. Consider, why did that moment stick with you? What was it that resonated to you? What about that moment was important? Soon you'll start to see patterns of the story come out. There are types of stories to think about. Big decisions. If you've had to make a big decision in your life, that's a good place to start. Or also embarrassing moments and mistakes, things that you can own now. Think about a time that you did something and it didn't go as planned. Think about a time that you, had big hopes for something and it either didn't work out the way you did or you saw it fulfilled in a way that you were expecting differently. Those prompts open up some vulnerability and they can really make a great story for it. If your life were a movie, what's the scene that you're never going to forget from the movie? What's something that somebody said to you that you'll never forget? Tell about a breakthrough moment, something that you'd been working on or pondering and then you finally busted through to the other side for. Or a moment that you just had to follow your heart, that maybe you knew that this wasn't a good logical decision, but it was a good emotional decision and had to follow your heart for it. Or a moment that you were reunited with something that you treasure. There's a lot of rich development there for what story you're going to pursue. And then at subpoint C, develop the story. Once you find the story that you want to tell, put it under the magnifying glass and blow it up big. Where were you in the moment? Were you physically in the moment? Where were you mentally in the moment? Emotionally in the moment? Where was it that you were sitting in? How did it impact your life? What were the results from it, right? You need to really sit in there and talk about what it was that made that a big moment. If it does something in there that makes it a big moment, then maybe we got to go find a different anecdote. Boil the story down to one sentence that'll help focus what it's really about, what you're really getting into there. For example, it took a disaster in my life to know about the important role that my father played in the community. This will help you decide which details are going to support the main point and which one actually advances the cause that you're trying to advance with your rhetoric. Remember that in any great story, you're not just sharing the things that happen. You're not just telling the details of the event. You certainly have to have those things, but that's not actually the point of how you're going to use it in rhetoric. You're sharing about your thoughts and your feelings during that event. Subpoint D, then start to figure out the structure for it. Now, most people are going to tell their story in a chronological order. They're going to start at the beginning, they're going to work through the middle, and they're going to reach an end for it. That's usually the best way to go and the part that's the most logical to the audience. It'll allow the audience to understand the moment in the same way that you experienced it. Now, there are some times where you would want to start at the end or start, near the end, something like that, and then find your way back to the beginning. This is helpful if the end is totally unexpected. If it's something that, it allows the audience to follow the tension of the story without being hijacked by this unbelievable ending to it. And I think like maybe one of the great examples of it is if you've ever seen the movie Gandhi. The movie Gandhi, actually the first scene is the last scene. They show the very last thing that happens to Gandhi, and then they roll back the tape and then go through all the things that lead up to that moment because it's a big, powerful moment, and it would feel, I don't know, strangely anti-cathartic to see the film end in a certain way that you were hoping it would, hoping it wouldn't end. So that's a great example of like putting the end at the beginning. Or I think of if you've ever seen the film Citizen Kane, where they show one of the last scenes, and then the whole movie is about unpacking that scene for it. That's those are really exceptions, and they have to be when the ending is something that will inform all the rest of the story. For most of us, most of the time when we're doing narrative storytelling, you'll start at the beginning, work through the middle, and reach to the end of it. It's the most logical way for the audience, and it lets them experience it the way that you experienced it. Some people tell the story as a whole series of flashbacks instead of a linear structure. Take caution with this. It's much harder. It could be a good method if there's several scenes that need to show gradual development or gradual entropy as things fall apart, but it's hard to do. And for the most part, it's not a way that an audience super enjoys experiencing rhetoric, or at least in storytelling. If you are using several small scenes, keep them short. Use the scenes to build to the climax over several instances along the way. Subpoint E. You also need to understand how you have changed by the end, because you do need to find some resolution for it. The climax has to have some kind of a falling action and resolution at the end for it. You have to have a sense of hope even after hard times. This is the real point. Real point as it's used in rhetoric. Know what your story is centered on. What are the tensions and how to tell the story. Writing the ending is usually the hardest part of a long narrative arc. Stories don't end up neatly. Like real life is not neatly tied up in a bow. Life is complicated and people are complicated. So when you reach your ending or reach the point where you just have to stop telling this story, end it in a place that's different from where you began. Again, you're not always going to, and everyone lived happily ever after, but you do need to show some change in development of the story. If the storyline is like, life is tough, and it's tough at the end, that is true. Life is tough, and it continues to be tough. But it's not a very good story. It doesn't show the climax and resolution for it. Show the audience your transformation over the course of the story, even if it's just a slight transformation. And subpoint F, if you're telling a story that's rooted in vulnerability or trauma, it's important to consider if you are emotionally ready to tell that story. Rhetoric isn't the same thing as therapy, or any kind of a performance isn't the same kind of thing as therapy. I think this all the time as a speech and drama coach in the forensics program. I see a lot of people trying to explore trauma in their performances, and I think that's a really valid way for a performer to try to reach catharsis over something that is worth trying to reach catharsis over for it. But sometimes I just wonder if that's the appropriate place to do it. It's important to see, are you emotionally ready to tell the story? Are you emotionally ready to take an audience through this part of the story? And can you show some development or growth at the end of it? If you get stuck on a scene of your story and you aren't able to come out of it because you're reliving it, or if your audience is going to be reliving it with you, that's a sign of maybe some post-traumatic stress that needs to be dealt with outside of the scope of rhetoric on it. Rhetoric isn't therapy, and you shouldn't work that way through it with people. Find care. It's tough to find an ending to a story even outside of traumatic events. And if it is tough to find the end to a story, it's perhaps that you're still living in that trauma on it. And you might need to press pause on this story for a little bit. You might need to return to it when you've had some more time to process it. Audiences are not entitled to your deepest, darkest moments. And if you're not sure, it's a good idea to go run that story through a mentor and get good perspective on the subject before you go and take an audience there with you. Because storytelling isn't actually about the storyteller. This is one of the great mistakes that people make in rhetoric and in storytelling. Storytelling isn't actually about the storyteller. It's about the audience, and it's about connecting to the audience, and you always need to be audience focused with it. That said, most of the time that we experience storytelling and narrative, we don't have that kind of traumatic experience. We're not trying to get there. We are just showing the development of a person. And it's conflict. And conflict is part of the story. And sometimes it's big conflict, sometimes it's little conflict, and that matters too. So I'm not saying don't engage problems. But make sure that we're putting it in the right context. There's a lot more to this. There's a lot more to the nature of rhetoric and even to storytelling, and I can't wait to tell you more about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.